Okay. Good morning, Keith. We're here with Keith Stroup, and he is currently serving as legal counsel for the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, more commonly known as NORML. He was the founder of the organization and served as executive director at least a couple of times. And did I get all of that right, Keith?
Yes, that's right. I'm still legal counsel for NORML. Mostly, in fact, since the pandemic, we've been working from our respective homes, but I actually had to come into the NORML office today to file some FEC reports. So I'm back in the office.
You're somewhat of a veteran of the cannabis movement, being involved from the very beginning. You started NORML in 1970, is that right?
Yes, late 1970. That's right. We actually started meeting, I think, in October of 70. We had a tentative board of directors. We didn't actually file our articles of incorporation with the District of Columbia until March 2nd of 71.
Awesome. Do you know of any other organizations that were around at that time when you started NORML?
The only other one at the time was a group called, it was an outgrowth of LEMAR. God, I haven't thought about that for a long time. I got to think for a second. Gordon Brownell, it'll come back to me. I apologize. I'm a little spaced out this morning. But there was another similar organization that was started on the West Coast that was, they made their money by selling rolling papers, Acapulco Gold, which was a fascinating idea that you could fund the legalization lobby by selling papers. The problem with it was that selling papers back then was considered a crime. Just as if you were caught with marijuana, you'd be arrested. You'd also be arrested if you were caught with rolling papers. So at some point, they had to give up that idea, and they merged with us and became the West Coast branch of NORML.
That was Amorphia, right?
Amorphia. I'm sorry. It took me a second to get my head working.
And so that's something that maybe people didn't realize, is that it wasn't just cannabis that was outlawed. It was anything having to do with cannabis at all.
Oh yeah, if you even if you had a clean something to clean your marijuana with, or a screen or whatever, that was considered illegal paraphernalia. And every state had not just anti-marijuana laws, but anti-paraphernalia laws as well.
Right. Wow. That's I guess, it's been so long, people don't realize that was the culture of the day, where and sometimes you couldn't even talk about cannabis, right?
Well, you're right. You had to be very careful who you shared the fact that you were a marijuana smoker, who you shared that with. I always thought it was kind of interesting because of the crackdown on marijuana smokers in the 60s and early 70s. We got to where when we would go to a party, we'd step outside to smoke a joint, and anyone else who wanted to smoke would come out. We'd stand in a circle and pass the joint around. And it was kind of building trust in a way. What you were doing, you were breaking the law with people, some of whom you may have known, but others may have been perfect strangers that just happened to enjoy smoking. It sort of forced us into a brotherhood at the time, where once we had made that connection with other marijuana smokers, we felt like we were part of a supportive community. Obviously the government didn't crack down intending to create a marijuana culture, but they did in fact contribute to the fact that we are now a recognized subculture.
For sure, for sure. Now, I was reading your book. It's normal to smoke pot, in preparation for the interview with you. And I read in there about how, in the early 70s, and after the Democratic convention that you attended with NORML, that you gained a lot of momentum for the movement, and attracted a lot of, celebrities and well-known folks to the cause. And it seemed like, all the momentum was towards, retracting some of the draconian measures against cannabis. but it seemed to stall out. What happened with that?
Well, when I look back at the legalization movement, I sort of see it in three phases. And the early phase was based on the report of the National Commission on Marijuana Drug Abuse. It came out in 1972. When that commission was created, by the way, we did not expect a lot out of it. It was a 13-member commission. 9 of the members were picked by former President Richard Nixon, and he just hated marijuana and the marijuana culture. And the other 4 were picked by Congress, 2 from the House and 2 from the Senate. So we thought it was going to be another one of these studies that just said, reefer madness, marijuana is terrible, screws you up, leads to heroin. Back then, the main allegation was it leads to heroin, it leads to harder drugs. We've gotten a little more sophisticated, our opponents, I should say, have gotten a little more sophisticated in today's world. They don't claim it leads to heroin, but they have other equally as silly allegations. In any event, when the Marijuana Commission report came out in 1972, it surprised us enormously. We were expecting another reefer madness report, and in fact, what they did is they recommended that we eliminate all penalties for the possession of up to an ounce, maybe it was even 2 ounces of marijuana. It's been a while since I've looked at that. Now, the commission went out of business, so NORML stepped in and started going around from state to state. And any state where we could identify a young legislator who was willing to introduce a decriminalization bill. And again, the Marijuana Commission didn't have the courage to recommend full legalization with the regulated market, although when you read the report, it's kind of clear that I'm sorry for the sound here, my phone. But they did have the courage to say, at least let's quit arresting smokers and let's let them share their marijuana among themselves for no remuneration. That was a big shock to us. And it turns out one of the reasons the commission ended up issuing a fairly progressive recommendation. Most of them were older white Americans, male mostly. I think there were 2 women on it, maybe only 1. Most of them hadn't even seen marijuana being smoked. They just weren't familiar with it. They knew younger people were smoking weed, and they'd obviously seen pictures on the evening news of anti-war demonstrators smoking marijuana and burning their draft cards, that sort of thing. But fortunately, a couple of the more progressive members of the commission set up some private meetings when they were out on the West Coast, in which they invited middle-class marijuana smokers to come. And while the commissioners were drinking or alcohol or whatever they had, these other marijuana smokers would light up a joint and pass it around. And the commissioners had a chance to see that it didn't make them crazy. In fact, it seemed sort of like drinking a beer or a glass of wine or whatever. So I think it was largely that personal experience that allowed the commissioners to feel comfortable recommending decriminalization. Now, back to the point of the momentum. Between 1973, when Oregon became the first state to decriminalize small amounts, and by the way, by the time the state legislatures began to pass those, they had tacked on $100 civil fine in almost all of them. They didn't quite have the courage to eliminate all penalties altogether. But between 73 and 78, we decriminalized marijuana in 11 states. And frankly, we expected that within a few years, we'd have it decriminalized all across the country. But we were in for a rude awakening. We had Ronald Reagan and Nancy Reagan, the Just Say No crowd, and the parents groups. The mood of the country along about the late 70s became far more conservative. So we went for 18 years without winning another statewide victory. From 78, when Nebraska became the 11th of those states to decriminalize marijuana, we didn't win another statewide victory. We won a few municipal victories, et cetera, until 1996. And by that point, when the issue surfaced, it was defined as the medical use of marijuana. All of a sudden, they weren't focusing on recreational smokers. They were focusing on medical users. And so the second phase was a whole bunch of states, mostly by a voter initiative, began to adopt medical marijuana. And then the third phase of the movement would be from 2012 on, when you first had Washington and you had Colorado and Washington legalize marijuana. And after that, obviously, we now, I think, have a total of 24 states that have legalized it and 38 states that allow medical use. So we've had phases of the movement where we were dead in the water, like those 18 years. But we've had other phases where we just continued to build support and to pick up additional states. Just to show you the reference point, when we started NORML, Gallup had just done their first survey asking the American public how they felt about marijuana legalization. Prior to that, they didn't even think it was an important enough subject to ask the question. But so that was the year before we started NORML. It was 69 when they first asked the question. Only 12% of the American public supported legalization. 88% were opposed to what we were trying to do. So I suppose we had a lot of naivete and idealism involved. As I look back on it today as an old man, if I were starting off on a project and I found that 88% of the public were opposed to what I was trying to change public policy, I might look around for a different project. I'm not sure. But again, a lot of naivete, a lot of idealism. We just thought, we knew we were right. And I think initially we probably expected that in order to win the issue, we had to turn on about 51% of the American public. Back then, I think that the feeling was you're never going to get their support unless they become smokers. Now, that isn't what happened. What happened is we now show, 88% support for medical use and 70%, 71% for recreational use. Most of those people are not smokers. Over the period of 3 or 4 decades, we gradually won the hearts and minds of a majority of the American public. It was slow work. It took a lot longer than we thought it was going to. But in the end, it wasn't necessary to turn them on to marijuana. It was simply necessary to convince them that prohibition caused more damage to people than the marijuana itself.
Yeah, that's interesting that, I had always assumed that the public supported cannabis reform, but obviously that's not true. The public, sentiment towards marijuana softened over the course of those decades. Do you credit your work and other organizations with raising public awareness to be able to change the hearts and minds of the American public?
Oh, I think without question. What we tended to do was, I was very careful during those early years. I always wore a suit, a coat and a tie. My hair was fairly short, longer now than it was then. We recognized we needed to change the image of marijuana smokers. And as we began to do that in more and more forums where we had the opportunity to speak or whatever, they began to recognize we didn't seem like a big threat to America. There didn't seem to be a real justification to arrest us, throw us in jail. And also, remember, there was at a point we had, I think, almost 900,000 marijuana arrests a year in this country at the peak of the prohibition. That's a lot of lives to disrupt and destroy. Some of them were college students that were thrown out of college and never could get back in. A lot of them who weren't students were young adults, but they would lose their job when they got busted for smoking marijuana. So it was causing an enormous amount of disruption in communities. And once people began to recognize that, they were forced to ask themselves a question: is this necessary? Do we really need to do this to make marijuana, to make the country a safe place to live in? And of course, obviously, the truth is that most marijuana smokers are absolutely harmless. I mean, if anything, we fit that stereotype of sitting on the sofa and watching our favorite movie 3 times or whatever, but nothing dangerous.
So you had the facts. You were able to show these reports. You were able to show, scientific evidence that proved that some of these stereotypes about marijuana use were just incorrect. And
by the way, just to give credit where it's due, in addition to the political work that NORML was doing, we began to identify scientific experts who were publishing books around the country. And it gave us a lot of reliability, credibility. If I, as a young lawyer, a young public interest advocate, if I said we ought to legalize marijuana, that might not convince anyone of any consequence. But when you had people like Lester Grinspoon from Harvard, who came out in '71 with the best book that's ever been written on the subject in my mind, called Marijuana Reconsidered. But there were a lot of others. Joel Ford had a book, Marijuana, the New Prohibition. Andy Weil had a book, The Natural Mind. There were a number of authors who began to weigh in on this subject, and as we could identify them, we invited them to join our advisory board, or some cases they joined our real board of directors. So over a period of time, we began to as an organization to have the credibility that we would never have had without those experts.
Right, right. And I recall in your book that, your tactics were, more professional. You lobbied, you met with legislators, you met with, high profile political movers and shakers, basically. But there were also some things that you guys did, some aggressive tactics. I remember some pieing incidents and things like that. Some of the gimmicks. Were those tactics also necessary in parallel with more professional efforts to?
Well, when I look back on the '70s in particular and some of our tactics at the time, I realized we were desperate for attention. And a lot of times the major media would ignore us. But so you had to, at least we felt we had to employ some radical tactics. And we didn't do anything dangerous, but you're right. At one point, we threw a pie in a staffer's face. And he was actually the staffer of one of our opponents in Congress. I forget who he worked for, but we had invited him to speak at a NORML panel at a NORML conference in the early years, and he had agreed to speak. But once I realized that this guy was here, there's a guy named Aaron Kay, who's still alive, called the Pie Man. He was famous back then for throwing pies in people's face, not to hurt them, not with glass plates, but at any event, he came to me and said, I think I'd like to throw a pie on this guy. Joe Nellis was the guy, the staffer. I'd like to throw a pie on Nellis. And I said, I don't want my fingerprints on it, but enjoy yourself, go do it. And then he came back to me and said, well, do you have $10 or $5 so I can buy the pie? Well, I was silly enough to actually give him the money to buy the pie. So obviously that had a backlash for a while. So there were some people on the Hill that probably were not interested in working with us. So as I say, I think most of those tactics, we employed them because we were having trouble getting attention back in, especially in the earliest years. But I don't think they were helpful tactics. I think it would have been better if we focused on our coat and tie and making the case rationally. I was a creature myself of the late '60s and early '70s, the anti-war movement. The whole reason that I got involved in legalizing marijuana was in order to avoid the Vietnam War, I had the help of some good lawyers, and they managed to get what was called the critical skills deferment, which allowed me to stay here in Washington, D.C. I had gotten a job offer from a presidential commission called the National Commission on Product Safety. It was an outgrowth of some work consumer advocate Ralph Nader had done. So having spent the 2 years that I would have been in Vietnam, working downtown D.C. on a presidential commission, by the time that commission ended 2 years later, I was old enough that I wasn't subject to the draft. And for the first time in my life, I had a choice of what I wanted to do. And I really was exhilarated by this concept of public interest law, but I wasn't that interested in unsafe products. I started smoking marijuana when I was a freshman at Georgetown Law School in 1965. So by that point, I had been smoking 6 or 7 years. And I thought, well, let's just legalize marijuana. I was a bit naive about what would be required to achieve that goal, but I was turned on to the concept of public interest law because of my work with Nader. So I set NORML up as a consumer lobby. We wanted to represent marijuana smokers, where most people were used to thinking of smokers as being bad people and not people you wanted to be around or anything else. We took the other approach and said, no, smokers are good people. We're just ordinary citizens, and we go to work like everybody else and have a regular life, but when we relax in the evening, we smoke a joint, whereas millions of other people drink alcohol.
So it was important to make that connection to regular people versus, hippies that were using
Yes.
marijuana.
Yes, I think that's right. And as I say, I look back and recognize that we were we would do most of our stuff in a fairly traditional manner, but then occasionally we would do something that was a little outrageous. And I'm sure that set us back in the short run. But over time, we got our act together.
You mentioned, that you would try to get attention, I guess, from the media, right? And
Yeah.
from my understanding is that the media has generally, at least for the more recent history, covered cannabis favorably.
Oh,
Why do you think that's true?
I think once you got, I'm trying to think when we got maybe 50% support from the American public. It had edged up during the 70s from that 12%. I think we got as high as 24, 25%, and then fell back down for a few years with Ronald Reagan just say no period. But sometime along in the mid 80s, we started picking up support again, and it's never turned back. It seemed to me that a lot of the role celebrities played for us was the same. It was the same way you use media. In the early days, the media was generally hostile. They generally approached it from the standpoint that they had been indoctrinated with reefer madness, and they would approach it basically saying, "Well, but it leads to heroin. What do you think about that? Don't you think that's a danger? Aren't all these marijuana smokers going to end up being heroin addicts?" It was that kind of a coverage. But over time, the media became more sophisticated, just as the American public did. I think we had to educate a lot of people in the media similarly.
Right. That's awesome. Had was so it was a necessary component, you think, for the media to help spread, facts instead of the misinformation and disinformation that had previously been there, based on studies from the 1930s that weren't empirical and things like that.
Yeah, and in fact, by the way, even today there are certainly examples of that. Our opponents are more sophisticated than they were in the early years. But for example, there was just, I think it was in Pennsylvania, where some politician just came out and trashed the idea of Pennsylvania legalizing marijuana, even though all the states around it have already legalized marijuana. And he was doing it based on the fact that there would be a giant increase in adolescent marijuana smoking if they legalize marijuana. Well, there actually are all kinds of data out there right now. And what they show, surprisingly, is in the states where they've legalized marijuana, there's been a decrease in the percentage of adolescents who smoke marijuana. I think there's two reasons for that. One is that if you have a legal market, you have age controls. Those people who spent a lot of money and set up a business and got a license, if they get caught selling to people that are underage, they lose their license. They go out of business. Whereas obviously, if you're buying it off the black market, nobody asks for age ID. So that was one of the reasons that I think they changed. Oh, I forget. I lost my train of thought. Go ahead.
Maybe can I suggest maybe the other one is the forbidden component,
Well,
teenagers
yeah.
are rebellious,
Yeah, I was going to say that's exactly where I lost my train of thought. The reality is that most adolescents want to be different than their parents, and if all of a sudden their parents are accepting marijuana smoking, and in many cases are actually smoking marijuana, they sort of apparently lose interest in it. I think that's fascinating. It was one of our fears initially, was that we knew we had to be very careful that in the first few states where we decriminalized or legalized marijuana, there were going to be a lot of critics looking at the results. And if there were anything that they could twist into a public health issue, they would do it. But fortunately, the experience ended up being refreshingly fault-free in most instances.
Now, you mentioned earlier that, the cannabis movement has attracted people who do not consume cannabis or have no interest in consuming cannabis. Um, the work of NORML and other cannabis organizations seem to draw in a vast conglomerate of folks from all walks of life, all professions, all socioeconomic classes, all ethnicities and races. Why do you think that is? And is that something that maybe led to, the relative success of the movement?
Well, I think without question, as long as the marijuana smokers were primarily a group of privileged white guys, you didn't have the ability to reach the majority of the American public. But as we begin to diversify, I guess it's all called DEI today, but this was long before that expression was in the lexicon. It certainly was important that you had celebrities. It was important that you had some prominent women. It was important that you had some minorities. And most of us, those of us who worked for organizations, consciously reached out to make sure of that. We made sure that on our board of directors, we began to be more diversified ourselves. And as we succeeded in that, then we could reach out and we had an appeal to a broader audience. So I'm quite certain that that was one element of the legalization movement that helped us continue to gain speed. As I say, when you look at the series of Gallup poll results, and we have them on the NORML website at some point, and you see over the years, it was finally got over 30, and then it was up to 35, and then 40, and then 45, and then 50. And after that, as I say, we're now up to where I think it's 88% favor medical use, and roughly 71% favor a full adult use. So clearly, we reached a point where the public understood that prohibition was causing more harm than marijuana itself.
Great work on that, Keith. Great work. I wanted to ask about, they're obviously trying to approach states and trying to approach the federal government to get them to pass legislation did not work for a long time. And, starting in 1996 with California
Yep.
passing, a ballot initiative to allow for medical marijuana, that maybe that served as the template for citizens to take the power in their own hands and just pass initiatives on their own throughout the states.
Well, first off, it's important for people to realize that only half of the states offer a voter initiative alternative for changing public policy. So in half the country, we don't have the choice. We have to do it the old-fashioned way by going through the state legislature. And that takes longer because you start off with these elected officials being fearful that if they come across as being too sympathetic or too supportive of legal marijuana, they may get thrown out of office at the next election. Now, by this point, I don't think they have to worry much about that if you got 70% of the public on their side. But it was different in those early years. But it is true that in those states that do offer the voter initiative alternative, those were all of our early victories, statewide victories, both medical use and full legalization, were voter initiatives. Because if we could find a major funder who would put up a few $1 million in most states, in order to qualify for the ballot by a state initiative, you got to have $1 million or $2 million just to collect the signatures, and then you got to have $1 million or so to run a campaign and buy ads and all of that. So it's not a simple thing to mount an initiative, but we were able to do it in a few states early on, and in those states, we were able to pass first medical use and then full legalization, where the state legislature, oftentimes we didn't have any support among state elected officials, or maybe one or two people would be on our side, but we'd end up winning the state by 55% or 57%. So it was an important step. And the medical issue in particular, it's worth massaging that a bit. For millions of Americans who've spent their whole adult life being fed reefer madness, all of a sudden, for them to see that their grandmother, who suffered from MS, for example, benefited from marijuana. It was more effective than traditional therapeutic drugs. All kinds of cancer chemotherapy. A lot of people undergoing cancer chemotherapy, the side effects were really difficult. And the only thing that helped most of those people was if they were fortunate enough to have a friend who would introduce them to smoke a little marijuana. So once the American public began to see that not only is marijuana not a dangerous drug that leads to heroin, it in fact is an incredibly helpful therapeutic agent, that whole negative impression of marijuana got flipped on its head. And so all of a sudden, we were seen as basically a good force. This movement was helping America. It was the opposite of what we had to live with for most of those early years. So it's hard to imagine how much longer it might have taken us to finally get to full legalization if we wouldn't have had the medical movement in between. It played an enormously helpful role.
That's interesting you bring that up. I've read several media accounts that give a lot of credit to the AIDS community and the actual AIDS outbreak
Without a doubt.
because of the wasting syndrome. People could see physically how these folks were debilitated, and then they could see a dramatic change when they started using marijuana.
And you're right. It was the most visible subset of medical users were AIDS patients during those early years. And the difference, instead of people wasting away and dying, they were getting their appetite back. They were able to regain a decent lifestyle, etc. So as I say, it flipped the issue on its head, and we became for millions of Americans, we were doing a good thing, a helpful thing for the country. Whereas earlier they were scratching their heads saying, "What the hell are you wasting your time trying to legalize yet another drug?"
These guys just want to get high, right?
Yeah. That's right. And by the way, we were careful at NORML. We've always been out front about the fact that we think there's absolutely nothing wrong with smoking marijuana. It's fun to get high. It's a lot safer than drinking alcohol. So while some groups in the reform movement have kind of tried to keep their hands off the green, they don't say it's okay to smoke, or they don't say we're marijuana smokers. They always phrase it in terms of civil liberties. Well, we also argued for civil liberties, but we were out front about the fact that at NORML, we are a marijuana smokers lobby, and we're proud of it.
Well, NORML wasn't the only organization, although, the main driving force behind things, but there were a whole coalition of state and local organizations, grassroots efforts that were involved in making, what happened today. Can you talk about how maybe that was important to the movement a little bit?
Well, there certainly were different groups, and some of them, for example, could get funding from the Ford Foundation or from George Soros, or from groups where, at least during the early years, we certainly did not have access to those kind of deep pockets. There was an early group called the Drug Abuse Council that was played a very important role in the 1970s. That was funded by the Ford Foundation, and in addition to advocating for legalization, they also hired lots of advocates like myself as consultants. The organizations didn't have much money to pay us, so there were a number of years where I think received more income from my consultancy with the Drug Abuse Council than I did for NORML, even though my consultancy basically was to do what I was doing at NORML. They didn't really have any work for me to do. They just wanted to figure out a way to help NORML. But yes, there's currently another group that's similar to NORML called Marijuana Policy Project, for example. Now, they didn't start until I think 96, or I think it was 1996 they were formed. So they weren't around during the early years, but they played a role in that they managed to get some serious funding. And during the early initiatives, voter initiatives that were run, they were almost all sponsored by MPP, not NORML. Now, we obviously, if they ran an initiative in a state where we had some local chapters, we worked to support their initiative, obviously. But we didn't have a millionaire who was stuffing our coat pockets with dollar bills, so we couldn't sponsor voter initiatives.
I wanted to touch on just two quick things briefly before we end. And one of those was I've always noticed that there was an importance for the First Amendment and First Amendment freedom of speech type folks to be involved in the cannabis movement. And vice versa. I think that the First Amendment benefited from the cannabis movement. Why do you think that that was necessary to have that component?
Well, for one thing, it made the issue of legalizing marijuana more appealing to some really powerful people. Early on, for example, former Attorney General Ramsey Clark was a big supporter of ours. He was someone I went to when I was first getting ready to start the organization. He had retired as Attorney General and had become active in the anti-war movement. And so I managed to get in to see him. I wanted to ask him, I guess I wanted his blessing. I wanted him to tell me that what we were doing made sense. And Ramsey obviously wasn't a marijuana smoker, but he saw it as a civil liberties issue. He saw it as don't waste police resources chasing nonviolent marijuana smokers. So he also, once he got involved, he served on our advisory board for many years. He's the one who put me in touch with Hugh Hefner, and it was a result of Ramsey's support. The Playboy Foundation became our first major funder during the 1970s. They gave us roughly $100,000 each year, and I'd say many of those years that was half of our budget. They also gave us 2 full-page ads in Playboy magazine, and back then, the magazine I think had a subscription rate of something like 6 million, but each issue was passed around to 4 people. So before you had social media platforms, to be able to every month in and month out, have NORML material, NORML articles, NORML achievements prioritized in Playboy magazine, it's why almost anyone who ever heard about us, the first place they heard about us was from Playboy magazine. And I remember asking Ramsey Clark, one of the things when I first went to see him, I said, Ramsey, I've been suggested that I apply for funding at the Playboy Foundation, but I'm not sure if I'm comfortable with that. This was obviously before the Me Too movement, but it was a point where many of us were becoming aware that there were a lot of things about Playboy magazine that the majority of the country weren't comfortable with. And Ramsey actually said no. He said, Keith, I've been Attorney General of the U.S. I've published several books. And when I travel around the country giving lectures, when people come up to me, the first thing they say was, I read your Playboy interview. So he said, no, I would tell you, it's a great organization. They're going to help you a lot. Go seek funding from them. So
nice. Thanks, Keith. One last question, and this is a dreamer, looking forward into the future. What happens when it's legal entirely in the whole U.S.? Where does NORML go, and where does the movement go from there?
We've kind of gradually reassessed our ultimate goals over the years as we've made progress. Obviously, we look a little further along, and our ultimate position today is that we want marijuana smokers to be treated fairly in all aspects of their lives. For example, even in states that have legalized marijuana, in most of them, you can still lose your job. You can be fired because you test positive for marijuana without any indication that you ever use marijuana on the job, or that you ever were high on the job. You smoke at night or you smoke on the weekend, but the marijuana shows up in your system for days and even weeks if you're a long-term or a heavy smoker. So we need to take care of that. There's child custody issues. Right now, in most states, if a nosy neighbor smells marijuana and complains to the child welfare agency that somebody next door to her who has young children is smoking marijuana, the first thing they do is they come out and do a home inspection. They start off with the presumption that if you smoke marijuana, it must be an unsafe environment for the child to be in, which is total bullshit. They then make you take a drug education course and usually a parenting course, and they're not much better than they were in the 1950s. So obviously, we need to change the child custody laws in this country so they don't discriminate against people who use marijuana responsibly. That's enough. But the point I'm trying to make is this: as we stop the arrest of marijuana smokers, that had to be our priority. As long as you got large numbers of smokers still being arrested, we focus on stop the arrest of responsible marijuana smokers. But once you do that, then we want to deal with the more subtle issues. And I'll give you one final example of where I think it's headed. Right now, New York is the only state that's done this, but in New York's legalization law, they say any place it's legal to smoke tobacco, it's legal to smoke marijuana. If you live in an apartment building, for example, in most cities, you're not allowed to smoke tobacco or marijuana. Well, if you're middle class and you have a private home, maybe you can go out in your backyard. But if you live in an apartment building, you have no place you can legally smoke it. In New York, they now say, because you can walk down the city streets in New York and smoke tobacco, not in front of the businesses, but if you walk in a park or whatever, you're allowed to smoke tobacco. You're now allowed to smoke marijuana. I think that's an example of the smaller issues we will be dealing with in future years.
Still a lot of work to do.
Oh yeah, I would tell you that I wasn't sure I was going to live long enough to see the first few states legalize, and I sort of feel the same way. I won't live long enough to see everything achieved that we intend to achieve, but that's all right. We got a lot of other good people and younger people that will be carrying on the fight.
I agree, Keith. Hey, that's all I have for you today. Is there something that you want to say that I didn't ask, or something that's on your mind?
I felt like I was a little spacey here, and I'm not sure if it was because I'm moving around. As I think I've told you, we're dealing with a family member who's got a serious illness, and it's caused me to be a little not focused as well as I should be. But no, I enjoyed the session and look forward. I hope it works for you.
I appreciate your input, and I'm sure that those who this interview reaches and the information you've provided maybe inspires some more people to come and help with the further mission.
Oh, and visit our website. I would invite everybody. Just go to www.norml.org, because we're a nonprofit. There's a large amounts of really helpful information there. And you can sign up for a free e-zine, and once a week you'll get a newsletter from us that keeps you apprised of the latest developments in the issue.
Keith, I can't express enough gratitude and admiration for the work that you've done throughout your lifetime. You've pretty much dedicated your whole life to cannabis.
Yeah, I suspect there's still a lot of people out there that wonder why anyone would want to do that. But I have dedicated most of my life to legalizing marijuana, and certainly I've enjoyed marijuana the whole time. So
appreciate your time today, and appreciate you joining the interview. Hope your family member gets better, and I appreciate it.
Thank you, Scott. Nice talking with you.
You too. Bye, Keith.